So I think I've bought the wrong M2 Mac Mini, and today I want to give you a bit of an insight into how this all works behind the scenes. Firstly, this isn't an M2 Mac Mini, so it's actually the M1 version. So if you're looking for a review of the M2 Mac Mini, rather than telling me this isn't a review of the M2 Mac Mini in the comments, go and find one and watch it elsewhere because there are some fantastic reviews out there. But if you're interested to hear why I've ordered the wrong M2 Mac Mini, and more importantly, or hopefully more interestingly, how this all works when you're not part of the embargo crew, then keep watching. Apple doesn't send me products. This isn't a sob story, by the way. It's how it is. I budget for it as part of this business, but it does present some challenges. And this month, Apple completely surprised everyone who wasn't on the embargo list by dropping brand new chips, the M2 Pro, the M2 Max, a brand new M2 Mac Mini and M2 Pro Mac Mini, and two new MacBook Pros. I had no idea this was going to happen, which meant all of my content plans were thrown out of the window. Again, I'm not complaining because it's fantastic news for my brand, but the big challenge I had with this is that I had to decide very quickly which Macs to get to review. And I had a very short window to do this because I also wanted to do a reaction video, which I did, I'll link to above. And to do that and then also decide which Macs to buy, I had probably had about half an hour. And I'm going to level with you guys, I didn't use that 30 minutes very well. I thought it was a great plan in my defense, and this was the plan. So basically, this is the M1 Mac Mini. It's the 16 gig version with 512 gigs of SSD storage, and my hastily conceived plan last week was to get the M2 version of this computer as a comparison. So I spec'd up an M2 Mac Mini with 16 gig of unified memory and the 512 gig SSD. I then ordered a 14-inch MacBook Pro and configured it in the exact same way as my M1 16-inch MacBook Pro, so it's got the M2 Max chip completely maxed out with the 38 cores, 32 gig of unified memory, and a 2 terabyte SSD. So apart from the screen size, that 14-inch MacBook Pro pretty much mirrors what I've got in the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and again, I wanted to see what the generational difference was. There are two issues with this. The first one is that I've got to wait quite a long time for those two Macs to be delivered. At the moment, it's saying the 6th of February, which, well, it's like 2 weeks away, which is just no good for me at all. Secondly, I think those are quite boring comparisons. We know already, I think really, that the M2 chip is a fairly moderate upgrade over the M1 chip. Certainly, if you've got an M1 Mac Mini or an M1 MacBook Pro, you don't need to get the M2 version. So the plan was to do those two tests on the M1 Mac Mini versus the M2 Mac Mini, and the exact same tests on the M1 Max MacBook Pro versus the M2 Max MacBook Pro. But the longer I'm waiting for these Macs to arrive, the more I'm thinking, who cares? Now don't get me wrong, I'll still do those two tests and publish videos about them because I'm sure, joking apart, there are people out there who want to know the difference between the M1 and the M2 platform. But the more I think about this, the more I think I've done it completely wrong, and I've got a much better idea about what to do, in particular with the M2 Mac Mini. Now, regular viewers might remember that I'm planning on building a mini music production studio in this studio. And the plan was to centre it around the M1 Mac Mini just to see how much performance you can get out of this thing when it comes to music production. I thought, great, I'll run that for about 3 months, and then in theory, if Apple brings out a new M2 Mac Mini in, let's say, March, as was rumoured, then I can then swap out the M1 version for the M2 version and see how far we've come. Apple ruined that idea last week when they launched the M2 Mac Mini in January. And the other problem is that I think the M2 Mac Mini that I have winging its way to this studio, like I said earlier, just isn't interesting enough to put into this project. So once I've conducted those Final Cut Pro tests between the M1 Mac Mini and the M2 Mac Mini, I'm going to order a spec'd up, decked out M2 Pro Mac Mini and put it into this music production studio, because I think that is the Mac Mini that most people are interested in. And initial benchmarks, which I know I don't normally take an interest in, but the benchmarks for this M2 Pro Mac Mini are mouth-watering. As you'd expect, it absolutely smashes the M1 version, but more impressively, it beats, quite considerably, the M1 Max in terms of single and multi-core performance. That is really exciting. It's why I love the Mac Mini. It's why I've always loved the M1 Mac Mini. I built this business on this computer. So the idea of having a super-powered M2 Pro version is getting me very excited indeed. This just leaves the question of that 14-inch MacBook Pro. But I've got a plan for that as well. So this is my production desk. It's where I do all of my video production, obviously, and at the moment I do it on the 16-inch MacBook Pro. And as I mentioned earlier, the plan, well, the very hastily organised plan, was to replace this M1 Max MacBook Pro with an M2 Max MacBook Pro, the 14-inch version. The reason for the change in screen size is because the 16-inch MacBook Pro is becoming too big these days. I'm doing more travelling, it's too big in my backpack, it's just a pain in the backside. So I had this genius idea to replace it with a 14-inch version, but I didn't expect that 14-inch M2 MacBook Pro to arrive until later this year. So when Apple launched it last week, I had to order one, and again, it was just the wrong thing to do. Remember, the two things that matter to me when it comes to the MacBook Pro are video rendering time and video exporting time in Final Cut Pro, and I think, and I'll confirm this obviously in a week or so, I think I'm only going to see a few seconds saved in both of those tasks. That isn't worth the £3,700 that I spent on this 14-inch MacBook Pro. However, next year, hopefully, when the M3 chip arrives, I think we're going to see some serious gains. And that's because the M2 chip is basically the M1 chip turned up a bit. There's more to it than that, obviously, but the point being, it's just not a big enough leap. The M3 version will hopefully be made on a completely different process, so it's going to be 3nm rather than 5nm. I don't really know what that means, but I do know it's a newer process for making these chips, and it will result in much better performance. So basically, I shouldn't be buying a 14-inch MacBook Pro now. I should be buying one next year. I'm conscious I've been rambling on a bit in this video. It's very unlike most of my videos, but I wanted to give you guys an insight into how this stuff works sometimes. It's frustrating, it's amazing, I wouldn't change it for the world, but when you're not part of the embargo crew, you do have to make some very quick decisions about the Macs in particular that you get into review. And I do think I've slightly screwed up this time, although I'd love to know, what do you want to see with these M2 Mac Mini and 14-inch MacBook Pro reviews? Do you want me to look at those two comparisons? Are you bothered about the rendering and exporting time from Final Cut Pro? Or do you want me to do something different with those two Macs in the short amount of time that I'm going to have them? Let me know in the comments. And if you're going through the buying process of your own M2 Mac Mini at the moment, keep watching for a link to my full buying guide, which I know is ironic.